Welcome to Curasolic, the show where we question the past and imagine the future. Today, we are speaking with Robin Bartlett. Robin led the 1st Platoon in the Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile during the Vietnam War. For 7 months, he led a platoon on more than 60 helicopter combat assaults and search and destroy missions. Years after his service, he holds a bachelor's degree in comparative literature from Claremont McKenna College in California and a master's degree in media from Pace University in New York City. He has written numerous business publications and a professional book published by Dun & Bradstreet. He is the president of the New York and New Jersey chapter of the 1st Cavalry Division Association and a proud member of the 82nd Airborne Division Association.
So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to leave a comment, subscribe on all your favorite streaming platforms. We're mainly on YouTube, so if you want to, leave us a sub there, we would really appreciate it. It really helps us grow the channel, and I know you guys have been really helpful with that so far. So we thank you for watching this episode, and if you want to be, on the show and have an interview on Curasaholic, just send us an email, curasaholic@gmail.com. And we will see if your story fits our podcast. So enjoy.
To begin this interview today, we're going to be watching a YouTube video called The Trail, which is based on a short story that Robin Bartlett, who was a soldier during the Vietnam War, he wrote about his experiences during that time. So we're going to be watching this video and then react to it afterwards. So let's have a look.
The trail is only a meter wide and weaves its way through thick green and brown underbrush, so overgrown that even a jackrabbit would have trouble threading its way. Large thorny limbs form a matted barrier as you strain, push, shove, and bleed to get through. Wait-a-minute vines seem to take special pleasure in tripping you, spraining your ankle, causing you to swear. With each conquering, a new thicket presents itself, as though to say, "You made it through that one. Now try me." As the trail wears on, your sore muscles, aching feet and back, cry out for relief from a 40-pound pack filled with sea rations, ammunition, canteens, and combat equipment. 10-minute breaks ease the pain for a short while, and then you're numb again. Rest is a beautiful dream. You must conserve water, so you sip sweet mouthfuls, allowing it to run slowly down your cotton, dry throat. If you stop sweating, the dirt cakes on your arms and face, and you can't spare the water to wash it off. It's time to push on, waddling like a pregnant woman. The trail is a struggle between mind and body. The two fight every step, clawing a trough, your brain forcing you on. Your mind is filled with thoughts, home, cold beer, women, but ever alert for any noise, any false movement, anything out of the ordinary along the trail. There are so many things to remember. Keep alert, stay alive. You must kill him first. You must pull the trigger first, and you must be fast. But the trail pulls you down. Eyes droop, sweat drips into them, the salt burning and stinging. Dirty hands rub the tears away, and nails, bitten to the quick, scratch the mosquito bites from the night before. Alert! Alert! Keep your head up. Breathe deep. Don't think about home. Don't think about anything, except staying alive. Forget the pain, the aching muscles, the tired feet. Clear your mind. Protect your life. Don't let the trail win. The perspiration runs in big dirty drops off the stock of your M16 rifle. Your hands push the thorns aside, you work your body through, but your pack catches. You pull. Thorns cut across your shoulders. Damn! But keep following that little green trail. Keep pushing. Keep pushing. Feet obeying a harsh command. Listen. Alert. The jungle is quiet, and only an occasional monkey screams out, making you jump and duck.
So, Robin, after listening to that portion of that video called The Trail, your description of it is very chilling and very visceral. It really puts you into the shoes of the soldiers during the Vietnam War.
Boots.
What is it that, the boots, more precisely, yes. What is it that inspired you to write that short story?
So that's actually an essay that I wrote in Vietnam after I came out of the field as a combat infantry platoon leader, leading 28 to 32 men with the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile. And our area of operations was along the demilitarized zone in the northern part of South Vietnam. And I wanted to try to capture what it felt like on a day-to-day basis to walk the jungle in search of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese enemy soldiers. And the things that we thought about, and typically I did not walk point, except on one occasion, which was not a very smart thing for the platoon leader to do, but I wanted to have the experience myself. I usually walked 4th or 5th in line, and I was a target. The platoon leader had a 90-day life expectancy in Vietnam. Why? Because the radio operator was right behind him, and you carried a map in your thigh pocket and a compass in your breast pocket, and you were giving direction to your men. So I was always a target. But I wanted to try to capture the feelings and the emotions that the point man would have. And it was particularly appropriate because the terrain that we operated in was from the Gulf of Tonkin on the east to the Laotian border on the west. And when you were out by the Gulf of Tonkin, there was no overhead cover, sandy soil, rolling hills, very, very hot. As you got closer to the Laotian border, you ran into 3 canopy mountainous jungle. And that's where we spent most of our time because we were trying to interdict large North Vietnamese soldiers coming across through the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
That little video we saw was like pretty chilling and heavy. I think you portrayed it really well, and like you said, it's kind of put us in the boots there to experience what you guys had to experience. I mean, I'm sure we can't even fathom what it was like, but you gave us a little idea with that little video you created. So thanks for that.
Yes.
So how did you feel about, the draft that was going on in the early 60s, like, going back and before the Vietnam War? Did you always have like ambitions to become a soldier, or were you kind of forced into it?
So I come from a military family. My grandfather went to West Point. My father went to West Point. My brother went to West Point. I turned down an appointment to West Point because as I was preparing to go to college, I had gone to 13 elementary and middle schools and 4 different high schools. And I said, you know what? I've had enough of this military stuff, moving around every 2 to 3 years. But as I entered college, the Vietnam War was starting to escalate dramatically. Many students were being drafted right out of college or during the summer months, and I actually received a draft notice. So to avoid that, I joined my college's ROTC department and went through the ROTC program, which was really second nature to me. And upon graduation, I kind of sat back here with a college degree, very smart, right? Knowing everything there was to know with this wonderful college degree, and said to myself, you've never challenged yourself. You've never done anything that's been terribly difficult. So what is the toughest thing you could think of to do right now? And the answer to that was to volunteer for infantry, airborne, ranger, and the 82nd Airborne Division. And I pretty well got everything I asked for and more. So I wasn't necessarily gung-ho, but pretty close to it.
If you hadn't joined the military, what do you think you would have done with your life? What would you have ventured into instead?
Well, again, there was a lot of psychological pressure because of my family origins, and not only to serve, and we took those words, service to our country, very seriously in my family. That was our life's mission. Certainly, my father and my grandfather and my brother all were career officers, as well as being an officer was expected. And for a long time, that was a psychological pressure on me. So honestly, once I got involved with ROTC, there wasn't another. There really wasn't another alternative for me. I didn't have to volunteer for infantry. I could have chosen, because I was a distinguished military graduate, I could have chosen another branch. But as I said, I decided to challenge myself with the toughest job that I could think of at the time. And that was the brilliance of a 21-year-old college graduate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
of
at that
course.
age, of course, you think that you know a lot, but as you found
that
out
you can
yourself,
take
that,
on a
yeah.
lot too,
Mhm.
but then you see what you bargain for is quite,
Yep. I
immense.
learned a lot. Learned a lot very quickly.
Yeah,
Very
exactly.
yeah. What is the ROTC? What is that?
Reserve Officers Training Corps.
Okay.
But I graduated as a distinguished military graduate, which allowed me to become a regular Army officer. So I was not a reserve officer. I was a regular Army, regular Army officer, second lieutenant.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
And really, you emphasize that, is there a harder job or something harder to do than joining the military? In my opinion, I don't think there is. I mean, you guys really
Yeah.
go through some of the hardest
I
training,
would-
and
I would say that SEAL training is more arduous, more physically demanding, but the infantry training combined with Ranger School is the best that the American Army has to offer.
yeah. So how about you tell us a little bit about your training prior to going to Vietnam? What was the most challenging aspect for you, and what did it teach you about life?
I graduated and was commissioned on the same day. 2 days later, everything I owned was in my car. I was driving across the United States and joined the 82nd Airborne Division. I was there for about a month and then received orders to go to jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia. So I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and went through the 4-week paratrooper course and made my 4 obligatory jumps and earned my paratrooper wings. That was followed by infantry officer basic course, which was about 9 weeks long. And that was pretty routine, basic training, not terribly rigorous. But that was followed by Ranger School. And Ranger training was the most arduous, physically and mentally demanding training that the Army to this day has to offer. I went through that training with the West Point graduating infantry class, the graduating class of out of West Point. And for them, it was almost second nature. They had very similar types of training programs. The interesting thing about that course is that they take you to the point of mental and physical exhaustion and hunger, because if you didn't make your mission on a daily basis, you didn't eat. So I lost about 25 pounds during Ranger School. But that training was actually the best insurance policy any officer could have for Vietnam. It taught you small unit leadership techniques, and it taught you a lot about being courageous. It was physically and mentally demanding. And when you reached that point of total exhaustion, that's when they made you the leader. They said, okay, take over this patrol and carry out the mission. So you had to stay alert and stay awake to all of the things that were going on, because at any moment you might be placed in charge. There was another aspect to the program which was called a buddy rating. So in your squad, each of the soldiers rated one another. And as I said, I was in with the West Point class, and they were a tight clique. They called them ring knockers because they all wore their West Point rings on their hands. And at the end of the first phase, I found that I was in danger of failing the course because I got a bad buddy rating from these West Pointers. And then in the second phase, which is up in the mountains, the first phase is the down around Fort Benning, and it's very, very physically demanding. A lot of running, obstacle courses, and really just very demanding physically. Then in the mountain phase, you're doing a lot of mountain climbing, rappelling, that sort of thing. I came down with bronchial pneumonia, and that turned out to be a very good thing because I got recycled. And when I came back into the course, I was with the artillery graduates from West Point, and they were a little less gung-ho. And I had had a little bit of experience under my belt, so I knew when to volunteer and when not. And things progressed very, very smoothly from that point on. The course was 9 weeks long, but being recycled, it was 12 weeks for me. But the proudest moment, one of the proudest moments of my life was the day that my Ranger platoon sergeant, cadre sergeant, pinned that Ranger tab on my shoulder. And any Ranger who has gone through that program knows how important that award is compared to anything else you might achieve in the Army.
So first of all, I think it's great that you cherish that moment because obviously you had to go through some difficult training, and I'm sure it was really demanding. But I just want to talk about we read your book, so we bought your book, and I highly recommend reading it because it's there's a lot of good stories in there, and it could teach you a lot about just war in general if you're not too familiar. But there's one part of the book where when you're going through Ranger School, you mentioned that a lot of the West Pointers kind of would look down on the people from ROTC. Can you explain why that was?
Well, because the West Pointers are career soldiers, and the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps officers, did not have the same military preparation. We may have had more academic preparation depending upon the course structures that we pursued through our majors, but it was just a tight-knit group. And all of the senior officers, and the ones especially who have the stars on their shoulders in the United States, are predominantly West Point graduates. They train them to achieve the highest levels of military service possible. And so if you're not a West Point, if you're not a ring knocker, if you're not a West Point officer, you're kind of a second-class citizen, so to speak. It evens out after time and depending upon your assignments, but certainly at the very beginning, that tight, you're not able, if you're not a West Pointer, you don't get to join the club.
They had this like exclusivity about them, like us versus
same kind of exclusivity you might find in a college environment. If you went to Harvard or MIT or one of those Ivy League schools, you tend to have many graduates tend to have an impression of their education, rightly or wrongly so, that they are superior to other college educations. But that's BS.
Yeah. Really
it depends on the individual and what you study and how smart you are.
Of course.
Yeah, at the end of the day, if you could do your job well, right, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, exactly. Your performance in your particular field. So now we want to talk more in depth about your experience during the war. So when you were deployed and the literal hell that you went through a lot of the time fighting. Can you tell us what was one of the worst days that you did experience during the war?
So when I went to Vietnam, I left from the 82nd Airborne Division, and I was on orders to go to the 101st Airborne Division. They wanted to keep airborne officers in airborne units. because of the training and experience they had had. However, when I arrived in Vietnam is right after the Tet Offensive of 1968. That was the major turning point in the United States, both in the United States and in Vietnam, because of the success, the psychological success of the Tet Offensive of 1968. The public opinion in the United States shifted, as well as the senior leaders in Vietnam. Even though we killed 10 times more of the North Vietnamese than we lost Americans, the reality was they attacked 300 cities in a very coordinated manner and totally unexpected, and took over a dozen cities for a couple weeks period of time. It was a changing point in the United States and in Vietnam. So my orders were canceled, and I was at the replacement depot for about 3 or 4 days, and then finally was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division. And that turned out to be a very good assignment because the 1st Cav had more helicopters in it than in all of Vietnam. So the Airmobile concept, the Airmobile strategy was to bring troops to the fight by helicopter combat assault, as opposed to walking through and interdicting the enemy. So that meant that we were able to carry lighter packs. My pack weighed in at about 45 pounds, whereas other officers were carrying 60, 70 pounds. And we had more water, more ammunition, and had daily helicopter resupply as long as they could either get a helicopter into us or hovering over us to drop out supplies. And I mentioned the terrain that we worked in. But you asked me about the hardest part of my job, and that was the handling of KIAs, killed in actions, when I had a soldier in my unit who was killed. And it was the officer's responsibility. None of my men wanted to do this. I guess they were superstitious, perhaps. They thought, well, maybe it would be me the next time. But my job was to go through the pockets of the man who had been killed, put any personal effects in a plastic bag that went back to the battalion headquarters. And my medic carried these, what we called them, death cards. It was basically a 3x5 card with a hole punched in it and a piece of string. And you filled out the information. And for the first time, the Army was really attempting to record, as close as possible, the coordinates where that man had been killed. So they kept a record of where each soldier, as best as possible, where each soldier had been killed. And that card got tied to the man's boot along with one dog tag. The other dog tag remained around his neck. And we didn't have body bags. We had ponchos. So we wrapped the man in the poncho. And when the helicopter came in to take the man, the dead, out or wounded, these ponchos would flap around in the rotor wash. You didn't want that to happen because that could be very dangerous. So I carried a ball of twine and I would tie off around the head, around the waist, and around the feet. And we would send that man on his long journey home. The first one was the hardest. And that's the chapter in my book called My First Worst Day in Vietnam. And it really was my first worst day in Vietnam. And I had a picture taken of me so I would never forget how I felt on that day. There would be many more, not many more, but there would be more KIAs. But what was so hard about it is that you just had to take your feelings and lock them away. And you had to, I think it's very similar to what a police officer or EMS or even a emergency room physician has to do. And some of these wounds were pretty traumatic. And you just could not allow it to affect you. You had to do your job. And that was my job.
I know that you were alluding to a little earlier that they were trying to identify where the locations where the bodies were basically dropped, and you're referring to the first chapter in your book, and there is this one KIA nicknamed Robert in the book that was kind of like a green soldier you mentioned, right? That didn't have much experience in the field, and he was appointed to platoon sergeant, right? If I'm not mistaken. And
so, just a squad leader.
Okay. So he was appointed to squad leader, and he basically he was really eager to get his first kill, and he was really pushing towards that. And you gave him advice, saying that he should not assume too much leadership right away before getting into these higher roles, and that eventually led to his demise, right? Because he did rush in to the enemy location. So can you tell us the importance of kind of detaching your ego from like a leadership position?
So Roberts was what we called an FNG. That's an effing new guy. An effing new guy.
FNG. New guy, yeah.
And everybody was an FNG until you acclimatized, and you literally took 3 weeks to become used to the heat. The average heat was 100 to 105 degrees, and then in the deep jungle it would go up to 100. With the humidity, it would go up to 110, 115. And when Roberts joined our platoon, he was gung-ho. Mm-hmm. He wanted to earn his medals. He wanted to get his kills. First thing he did was salute me. And I told him, you are never to salute an officer. We wore no insignia. The only way you could tell I was an officer was on the band that ran around my helmet. It said LT Bartlett. We didn't even call each other by our names. My name was either LT, which stood for lieutenant, or 16. 16 being the first platoon leader, 6 being the leader. And everybody had nicknames. And that was good because as an officer, there were times when I had to put men in harm's way. And I couldn't be close to them. The only ones I even got remotely close to were my platoon sergeant, my radio operators, and my medic. That was my little command group. And I knew them pretty well. We huddled together in the same foxholes, but I could not afford to have a close relationship. And Roberts wouldn't listen. He wanted to get his kill. He went out on a patrol. I wouldn't make him the squad leader. He was justified in being a squad leader because he had the rank. But I would not allow him to take over as a squad leader until I felt like he was acclimatized and knew our protocols. And as I said, he went out on a patrol. I told him that the squad leader would be in charge. He was not in charge. He understood that. But when they got into a sniper attack, he stood up and charged, foolishly charged the enemy sniper, thinking that he could take him out. And he was killed. The bullet went right through his forehead.
Wow. Yeah, it's a pretty chilling story. I mean, I guess it is a lesson, right, to like assume your position properly and understand that not let ego get into the way necessarily. Especially like you said, he was still inexperienced in the field, right? I think he probably should have listened to your advice there.
I did 3 things in my platoon that I think allowed me to survive. As I mentioned before, a platoon leader had a 90-day survival rate, and I completed my tour. Now, I was wounded 2 times. Fortunately, not too severely. They were shrapnel wounds. But I did 3 things that I think helped me to survive my tour in the field. The first thing was I tried very, very hard not to do stupid stuff. Now, that may sound kind of silly, but it was very important. For example, I had a fellow officer who was with me in the 82nd Airborne Division. And we would bring in helicopters on a regular basis with hand signals because the pilot needed to be directed exactly where you wanted him to land. And so we had a protocol that was, various different hand signals and telling the helicopter pilot what to do. Very simple. But he stood on a mound to give these signals to the helicopter pilot. And when the pilot landed, the rotor blades took off his head.
Oh my God.
Oh my goodness.
So that's an example of being stupid. Secondly, when I joined my platoon, I sat down with my squad leaders and my platoon sergeant, and I said, you guys have more time in the field than I do, and I want you to tell me if you think I'm doing something wrong. I said, I'm still going to be the leader. You're not going to be in charge, but I want to hear what you have to say, and I want to listen to you, and I want to take advantage of your experience. And that kind of set the tone for the leadership within my unit. And then the third thing I did was I listened to my point man and the cover man. These are the two men who are most vulnerable to ambush and to being killed, because they're not only looking ahead, but they're looking down for booby traps, and it's a very nerve-wracking situation. And occasionally they would have a bad feeling about what we were facing, and they would call me forward. And if you couldn't hear any birds chirping, if you didn't hear any monkeys screeching, or even if they had a kind of a sixth sense that something was wrong, I would shoot artillery. This was called reconnaissance by fire. So I would fire artillery in front of the position that we were going to be walking through. And I shot a lot of artillery. In fact, I shot so much artillery that the battery that supported us put a budget on me of 25 rounds. They said that's the most you can shoot for reconnaissance by fire. But when my men walked through this area that had been blasted by an artillery barrage, they felt a lot more comfortable, and they respected the fact that I was not putting them in harm's way.
Okay, you were taking extra precautions, really. You were trying to be as safe as you could.
Well, and listening to the two men who were at the front who were most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think
sometimes it was, believe me, sometimes it was just a sixth sense. They just had an uneasy feeling.
Yeah, I think you just kind of developed that by being in those environments. I imagine every little sound, sight, movement can trigger, something in you where you feel that.
Yeah.
The men who had hunted, back in the States, maybe hunted deer or hunted, whatever animals it might have been, they were better at being the point. But it had to be rotated among all the soldiers. There was no favoritism. Okay. Every man walked point at one point in time.
Okay. So everyone had that experience there. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, and I just want to say something that you mentioned earlier that I think is a skill that we should learn to develop just in life in general, right? And you mentioned that listening to, your superiors and just listening to any feedback that they might have. I think that's a really important skill to have just in general, right? Just to listen and understand that, you'll get better advice if you just stop talking and listen to the person that's talking to you, because you'll learn better that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and my platoon sergeant was supposed to be the man in the unit with the most experience. Typically, a platoon sergeant has 8 to 10 years of military experience, but mine had gone through an instant NCO training program. NCO is a non-commissioned officer, and he came out of that course as a platoon sergeant, a Sergeant E6, and he actually had his 19th birthday in Vietnam. So he and I had about the same level of experience. At 22, I was the second oldest man in my unit. We had one man who was 24. 90% of my soldiers were draftees, and the other 10% were had volunteered to join the Army. So
see.
90% of them were drafted and 10% had volunteered.
It's crazy how young,
Yeah.
everyone was. Like,
The age at which,
Yeah.
because nowadays, if you would compare anyone like less than 25, they're still like children. I think also back in those times, like you just had to grow up faster. Would you say, like, to mature quicker? You just had no choice but to assume these responsibilities in life, and
Well, and keep in mind too that the war was escalating, and there was a demand for more and more and more American soldiers. Westmoreland kept saying, kept saying to Johnson, if you give me more troops, I'll win this war. And they took it up to 550,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. That was the cap at the time. So when I was there in 1968 to 69, that was how many American soldiers we had in Vietnam. So that required tremendous assets from the draft, and they were drafting 18 and 17 and 18. Well, 17-year-olds had to volunteer, but they were drafting 18, 19, 20-year-old unless they had a deferment. So that's where that young group of soldiers came from.
I see. Yeah. So it was that high demand that of soldiers that kind of forced them, to go with younger and younger soldiers there.
Do you think that, that affected like how things would happen in the field, right? It just like the inexperience and how young and immature a lot of, the people were. Like, how do you think that affected the missions and operations you were on?
Well, they all had good combat training. They were all put through the same level of training, not as rigorous perhaps as I went through, but still they knew the protocols, and they knew how to react in a combat situation. And they became very adept very quickly if they had any doubts. If we had some FNGs who were squirrely and just not trustworthy, we found jobs for them in the rear because we couldn't trust them. And you gave them about 3 or 4 weeks to make the adjustment and be in a first firefight and recover from that. And then they had a little more confidence that they could handle the situation. But they were well-trained soldiers, I will say that.
Yeah.
At least.
And I guess at that age, in terms of physical fitness, right, you must be kind of like in your prime.
The best. Absolutely the best.
Yeah.
To endure all of that.
Yeah, for sure. I guess that's what they need, the most fit and performance soldiers, basically. So
But unfortunately, them being young, that's the tragedy of it, where a lot of them lose their life at such a young age. They haven't had the chance to, build a life, and they pass away so young.
That was kind of the burden that I bore, because I had to direct them. I had to give them orders, and I worked very hard not to put them in harm's way and to make intelligent decisions. But there were times when they were in harm's way.
I want to ask you a question on that, because you were saying how you had to identify these soldiers that were KIA, and one of the worst ones was the first time that you had to do that. Can you say like how the loss of some of your comrades has impacted you in life? Like how do you feel, or how have you become, have you been desensitized towards seeing death? How does it impacted you?
Well, I wouldn't. At the time, I would not allow it to impact on me. Would not allow it to have an impact on me. I would not allow it to affect my feelings. I buried it. The way I thought of it was that I locked it away in a titanium steel trunk in the back of my mind, figuratively. And it changed me. It changed my personality. It changed my feelings. To this day, my wife often says to me, "Your greatest strength is that you are fearless, and your greatest weakness is that you are fearless." But that's the way we were trained. I was trained to be fearless, to be courageous, to be aggressive. That's what that Ranger training did for you. It made you a tough guy, badass tough guy. And there was never once. I know this may sound as if I was bragging, but there was never once in the time that I was in the field that I did not feel in control and in command of the situation, both physically and mentally, because of that training. As I mentioned before, it was the best insurance policy that the Army had to have. So it trained you to be courageous, it trained you to be fearless, and it trained you to be aggressive. And to accomplish those things, you just had to take those personal feelings and lock them away. It wasn't until about 20 years after that some of those experiences started to kind of seep out. I had leakage from my trunk.
Yeah.
And it wasn't nightmares per se, it was daydreams. I was having daydreams of some of these events. And I had a friend, my civilian career was in publishing, and I'd helped a woman who was a psychiatrist get her book published. And I happened to be near where she lived, and I went to see her, and I said, "Well, I want to have a meeting with you because I'm having this problem. It's really bothering me a great deal, these daydreams." And I sat with her, and she gave me. I explained the situation, and I broke down. I explained what was happening to me, and she said, "Well, you're just experiencing PTSD." And she gave me some very simple exercises to practice, and I did, and they didn't go away per se, but they were easier to manage, and they didn't affect me. They didn't make me feel as if I was losing my mind. And actually, writing this book was supposed to be kind of a catharsis for me. But in reality, it brought back all of the events. And some of them were pretty horrific. Some of them were humorous too, but they brought back all those events. And I had some tough times remembering, because it's amazing how much detail your brain can retain. I had a job that took me on long airplane flights, to include Canada, by the way. And that's when I would write. I'd get out my laptop and I would write. And there were times, my favorite author is a guy by the name of Stephen King, who's, of course, a wonderful author of horror. But he wrote a wonderful book called On Writing. And in that book, he talks about falling into his typewriter, meaning that he got so engrossed in what he was writing that everything around him just disappeared. He fell into his typewriter. And that would happen to me. And I was amazed at the detail that my brain retained about some of these events. I could see the colors. I could remember the detail of the event incredibly well. I would come away sometimes sweating. And there were times I even smelled the smells. I know that's crazy, but it happened. But writing the book was not the catharsis that I had hoped it would be. Talking about it after the book was published, and I've been participating in podcasts and talking about it now, that has helped me to put a lot of these events in their place. And it's been 55 years, so the events are still there, but the edges of those stories are a little bit softer now. They're not quite as horrific as they once were.
Yeah.
So I have one of those events written down here. If you are comfortable talking about it, we could get into it. There is a chapter 12 in the book called Saturation Ambushing. Are you okay to talk about it? If not, we don't have to get into that.
I can't talk about that event in detail. I can only say basically what happened.
Okay.
Okay.
Saturation ambushing was a technique that we practiced in when the temperature got extremely high or the humidity was extremely high and water was at a premium. We weren't allowed to drink from streams, so they had to resupply us with water, and we couldn't drink from streams, by the way, because of Agent Orange poisoning. And so this technique was we would take the entire company and we would set up in small ambush units along a 5-kilometer trail that we knew from experience was heavily trafficked. The enemy only moved at night, whether it was Viet Cong or North Vietnamese. They only moved at night. They never moved during the day because they knew that if we captured them, we caught them during the day, we had superior firepower, and we would eliminate them. So at night was when they moved. And by the way, they were extremely good night fighters, much better than we were. So my ambush on this saturation ambushing situation, in other words, you sat up in an ambush all day long, so you weren't walking through the jungle. You weren't exerting yourself. You were just setting up in an ambush for the entire day and night. And we had a single soldier come into the first ambush on this 5-kilometer trail. And after that single soldier passed, the report was given to the company commander, who was at the fourth ambush, that we had a single soldier coming down the trail. And the company commander was concerned that he was the point man and there might be more enemy soldiers behind him. So the soldier passed the second ambush, and the same report was given to the company commander. Again, the company commander was concerned that there might be more enemy soldiers coming along. So he instructed me to take this enemy soldier out silently. And I asked for volunteers if anybody was willing to do it, and no one was. So I told my radio operator who carried a .45 pistol that I would move down to the trail, the edge of the trail behind a tree, and he would stand right behind me with his pistol ready. And if I got into trouble, he was to shoot the soldier in the head. Not me. I made sure he knew the difference between the enemy soldier and me. Took off my helmet, went down to the tree. Radio operator stood right behind me. And this soldier came down the trail, and I had to kill him with my knife. And that was a very, very traumatic experience. Not one that I care to remember, but it had to be done. And there were no further enemy soldiers coming down the trail. So we pulled the body off the trail and resumed the ambush. So that was a very tough experience. One of those ones that I had to lock away in that trunk.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. We appreciate it. And like you said, you were doing your job, and how were you able to deal with that? I know you mentioned you went to see a psychiatrist. What were some of the the tricks that she gave you to dissociate from that?
You're gonna laugh at this. What she told me to do is so simple. When I had the daydream, the recurring daydream that was bothering me, was coming back to haunt me, I was to tell this soldier, I was to apologize to this soldier for killing him, and to tell him that it was my job to do this, and that I was very sorry that I had to do it, but this was the job I had, and to ask him not to bother me anymore, and to do that repeatedly every time the daydream affected me. And I did, and it as I said, I can still recall the event if I allow myself to, but it doesn't come back to haunt me. Let's put it that way.
Wow.
I know it sounds very silly, very that's such a simple thing, but that's exactly what I had to do. I had to tell him, I'm sorry I killed you. It was my job to do that.
Well, I mean, like, you know, in hindsight, it makes sense, right? Because I guess you were just not able to like detach from, you know, what you had to do, and, you know, doing your job. So I guess what the psychiatrist says does make sense to like ask for forgiveness, which is, you know, a good way to cope. Yeah.
You're asking for forgiveness. You're asking, I guess, that soldier to not take what you did to him personally, even though it's well, of like, course,
it's all in my mind, right? That whole event is in my mind. There was no ghost.
Yeah.
You know, this was a daydream that was reoccurring in my mind, and I was allowing it to come back into my memory, come back into my thought process. So by saying that, I created closure to the event. I created, in my own mind, I created closure and an ending, and psychologically, I guess I brought it to a conclusion.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
It. You know, it's something very hard, Robin. I mean, I don't think anybody can really understand it unless they've lived it, and you know, I mean, as much as you've tried to be tough and to keep it locked away, as you said, you know, just one day it is going to come out, and I think that's the thing. We all need to learn ways to come to terms with some of these traumatic experiences that we live, and you know, we thank you for sharing that.
Well, and interestingly, I've talked to a lot of veterans, and many of them tell me much the same thing, that they had some nightmares when they came back, but it wasn't for many years afterwards that they really started to have PTSD impact them and to seek help for that. And those that sought help to this day have profited from that help. But the ones who continue to have it buried, it can really change you. And it did change me. It changed my personality. It made me a much, much different person. And I have had to work very hard with my own children, my own sons, and my wife to bring back a personality that is less militaristic and
more open,
more loving.
Yeah, vulnerable.
I'll tell you, one of my biggest accomplishments is being able to hug and tell my sons I love them. Believe it or not, to say those words, for a while there was very difficult to do. You lose your sense of love and empathy. I lost it for a long time.
And I guess that has to do with just being vulnerable with yourself and kind of your feelings, and like, because you want to have this wall and like closed off and not show, because I guess to love someone is to, you know, be vulnerable and to, you know, maybe have that, because when we love something, you know, at one point it's going to be over and we're going to lose them, right? So maybe it's a way to safeguard ourselves from feeling.
Well, and remember too that when soldiers came back from Vietnam, they were not respected. They lost the war, and that was the way many of them were treated. They took off their uniforms and they threw them away. And for many, many, many years, I never told anyone about my military service. It was not something that I wanted to, because you never knew how they were going to react to you if you did reveal that. And it's only recently, since I wrote this book, that I have started to make people aware. And it hasn't been an easy task.
So until sort of, you know, in the recent years, couple of decades, that you've let people know then that you were a soldier.
Well, and I think Americans are because of, you know, they soldiers who were in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were welcomed home, And so there's a feeling, a general feeling among the population, within the American population, that we didn't treat these Vietnam veterans very well, and maybe we should do something about it. And that's a truism. They were not treated well when they came back.
Yeah, yeah. No, for sure. And we do want to talk now more about you coming back from your deployment and into civilian life. One aspect that we want to talk about is seeing your parents after you came back. How did you feel after that year?
So I'll just give you a little bit of a story that goes with that answer. I was within a month of leaving Vietnam, and I had not received orders. An officer fills out a form called a dream sheet, and you put down where you would like to be assigned to your next assignment, remembering that I was a regular Army officer, so I had more time to serve in the Army. And at one point in time, I was planning on a military career. I was thinking about a military career. And so I talked my boss into sending me to Saigon for 3 days to buy art supplies for our unit and to find out what my orders were. So after 2 days of having a really nice time in Saigon and drinking a lot of beer and eating some very good food and doing some sightseeing, I worked my way to the MACV headquarters. That's Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And it was ushered into an actual gymnasium with the basketball hoops pulled up. And on the floor of this gymnasium were these low wooden trays. And in the trays were punch cards. The computer programming at the time was Fortran computer programming, punch cards. And every card in these trays represented a soldier in Vietnam. So there were like 550,000 punch cards in these trays, all in alphabetical order. So we walked down the aisle, A to B to BAR to Bartlett Paul to Bartlett John to Bartlett Robin. Pulled my card and said, "Oh, you're going to Seattle, Washington." Fort Wainwright. And I said, "Wait a minute. I went to high school in Seattle, Washington. There is no Fort Wainwright in Seattle, Washington." And we had to actually go get a directory to look up where Fort Wainwright was, because I thought I was going to either Fort Lewis, Washington, or Fort Ord, California. Fort Wainwright is in Fairbanks, Alaska. So here I was in 105-degree heat, and I got orders sending me to Fairbanks, Alaska. I told my parents that I would be flying back sometime between May the 5th and May the 10th. I couldn't be sure when. And at the time, there was a cap on the number of American soldiers, and the cap had been exceeded. So they were really pushing to get soldiers out. So I again talked my boss into letting me go down to the replacement depot early. I went down on May the 7th and fortunately was able to get on a flight back on May the 9th. And as an interesting sideline, my wife was born on May the 9th, and my youngest son was born on May the 9th. I went to Vietnam on May the 9th. I came back from Vietnam on May the 9th, exactly 365 days. I have played those numbers in every conceivable combination, and I've never won anything.
That is crazy. That is fate right there.
I know, isn't that funny?
Cannot be anything else than fate.
So we landed at Travis Air Force Base in California at about 11 o'clock at night. And I looked out the window of the plane, and I saw two people standing on the other side of the fence at 11 o'clock at night. And I said, "Those are my parents." And my father had been in the Air Force. He, after West Point, after the end of World War II, he was an engineer, civil engineer, and the Air Force needed engineers. So the Army was actually going to reduce him in rank. He had been promoted up to the rank of major. They were going to drop him down to first lieutenant. And the Air Force said, well, if you come with us, we'll make you lieutenant colonel. So then there was no question there. He joined the Air Force. And so he had some pull. He was a full colonel upon retirement. So he knew some people at Travis Air Force Base, and he was able to determine the flights coming out of Benoit, Army flights. And he met every flight coming back from Vietnam from May the 5th until May the 9th. And at 11 o'clock at night, we were all, of course, dressed the same. Got off the plane, walked over to the fence, and I kissed my mother through the fence. And she didn't recognize me until I got about 2 feet away from the fence because we all looked the same. And that was a terrific moment for me. It really was. And in many respects, it was a wonderful thing because I had my orders. I knew where I was going. And I was released right then and there. And they took me back to our home in Monterey, California. And I spent about 2 weeks just getting everything ready to go to Alaska. I had a lot of things that I had to get uniforms, and I had to get my car ready to go to Alaska. A lot of preparations to be made. So I didn't have any interaction with protesters. I had no contact with any of the activities that were going on. And I was still in the military community. So when I got to Alaska, I was still in the military. And of course, there was no protests in the military. That was not allowed. So I avoided all of that negativism that was rampant in the United States at that time. And my parents had the foresight to realize that they would protect me from what was happening in the United States by bringing me home and sheltering me from that activity. So that's where I spent the next 2 years in Fairbanks, Alaska, minus 20 and minus 30 degrees below zero.
Wow, such a drastic change from
Vietnam to Alaska. Yeah,
it really was
quite a difference.
Must have been a bit of a shock there. Yeah,
it was a big shock.
A big shock.
Yeah. Were you kind of glad to go to a cooler climate after spending all that time in Vietnam?
Not particularly. No, I was kind of hoping for Fort Lewis, Washington, or Fort Ord, California.
Interesting.
Because I know in the book you
when
mentioned,
when I arrived in Alaska, I had 2 years in the. I think I was promoted to first lieutenant after 1 year. By comparison, it took my brother 4 years to be promoted to first lieutenant. It took my father 8 years to be promoted to first lieutenant. And after 2 years, I was promoted to captain. So at this time, I was now 24 years old, and I was a captain. And I was put in charge of a headquarters and headquarters company, which was 250 men and $25 million worth of Army material and equipment. And really was totally unprepared for that assignment.
I imagine, you're at such a young age and already a captain and have so much responsibility.
Yeah. So going back on, how the veterans were received after the Vietnam War, how does that make you feel? You put everything on the line, you sacrifice your life, and then when you get back, you hear about these protesters. Like, how does that make you feel?
Well, I've talked to a lot of veterans who had many different experiences. As I mentioned, I was fortunate and did not have that experience, although I did hide my military service once I got out of the Army. Once I resigned my commission and got out of the Army, I hid my military service. I did not talk about it. Nobody knew. And but I've talked to a lot of veterans who had some really difficult and bad experiences. Especially, they were released from Oakland Army Terminal, and they had money in their pocket. And they went into San Francisco, went to bars, and they had some tough times. So and you know, this was 1969, and the war continued for another 6 years. And you know, in writing the book, I really thought about that extensively, and I'm saying, well, why, you know, once the turning point had happened in 68 and 69, why did it take so long to end this thing? And the only conclusion I can really come to is that Johnson and Nixon and other military leaders did not want to be classified as the first president of the United States to lose a war. And the American popular opinion was that our soldiers, in fact, lost the war. Well, we didn't lose the war. Trust me, we did not lose the war. Anytime we were in a conflict, we always had superior resources, superior firepower. Yeah, we lost some men, but we always trumped the enemy 10-1, especially in that first Cav division, because we had such tremendous access to such tremendous resources: artillery, helicopter gunships, Cobra helicopters, even jets and napalm. I used them all. Even on one occasion, we had some fire from offshore batteries from a naval fire. But you know, that's my conclusion, and that the war was prolonged unnecessarily, which cost lives unnecessarily, and nobody. There was a turning point in Vietnam too, because the new soldiers coming over were familiar with what was going on in the United States, and they brought that information to the field. And so there were, and of course, you also had the experience of Lieutenant Calley, and that was a terrible event where he allowed and instructed his men to sacrifice almost an entire village, killed women and children and men, you know, that blew up in the United States as well as the. I mean, there were a number of things that happened in the United States that caused the public opinion to really sour on the war. That was certainly one. And even Walter Cronkite, you know, who was the voice of America, said, you know, the best we could hope for was stalemate, that we were never going to win this war. And, you know, when you think about it, part of the problem that the American soldiers and American Army had, was the fact that we were fighting in a country about the size of California. And we had to stay within the state of California, whereas the enemy could escape to Nevada, Arizona, Oregon. They could go across the border, but we couldn't pursue them. And when you think about it, if you were the enemy, that was a very fortunate thing to have happen. But at the end, you know, Nixon, even Nixon, prolonged the war because he wanted, as he said, peace with honor. He wanted to assuage his public opinion that we didn't lose the war. It was the South Vietnamese army that lost the war. And he brought the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table by bombing the hell out of Hanoi. We lost a lot of airmen, a lot of B-52 bombers, but we brought them but that effort brought them to their knees and brought them to the Paris Peace Accord. But it took a couple of years to make that happen, and that was wrong. That was just plain wrong.
Yeah. So what were these protests like about? Like was it about like killing innocent civilians? Like what were these people mad about? And you know, is it true?
Yeah, were they justified in their protests? You know, in your opinion,
I think they were very justified in their protests. Every night on the news, at the end of the news broadcasts, they would show photographs of the men who were killed on that day in Vietnam, and how they got the photographs and how they got the names, I don't know.
Wow.
But they had B-roll video showing the deaths of that week or of the previous couple of days. And it just, it was a little bit like, I don't know if you get all the news that we get on a daily basis here about Trump, but it became overwhelming, totally overwhelming on a day-to-day basis, death after death after death after death. And the protests were carried out certainly on campuses, but there were Gold Star mothers, and when those jeeps came up to their house with an officer and an NCO to bring the news that their son or husband had been killed in Vietnam. And keep in mind, too, that during this Operation Thunder, we lost about 17 B-52 crews and 17 B-52s during that final onslaught against Hanoi. And that's a lot of men and a lot of airplanes. Those airplanes are huge, multi-million dollars. But that that just capsulized the feelings in the United States. They were just stop this death. This is unnecessary, and bring them home. And they started to bring them home, but even so, they were still engaged in a lot of turmoil.
Yeah.
So what was the purpose of showing like these B-roll, of all the killings like on TV and all? Like, do you think there was a reason for that? Like, I don't quite get that part.
Well, I think that the press adopted the point of view that this war should be brought to an end. And the way the press operates in the United States is to, death tells the story. So, I mean, if there was a killing in the United States in some city, that's national news. All of, even today, if there is some crazy shooter goes into a school and kills a bunch of students, that's national news. And they want to show photographs of what happened. They want to show the yellow tape. They want to show the blood. They want to show the ambulances. And at the time, the best they could come up with was to find out who these soldiers were. Often they would get photographs out of college and high school annuals, and that's what they would. They just ran the name and the person. These are the soldiers who were killed this week in Vietnam, and they did it again and again and again and again.
Wow.
It was like there was a constant onslaught of imageries of death and
it was the American press making a statement to the American people. This is what's happening. Be aware of this is what is happening. And the American press was embedded in Vietnam. They were there on a daily basis. I had press that would come out and want to fly with me, and I would never allow them to do so. But they came out.
Oh yeah, okay. I guess they would also put themselves into danger.
Sure,
just
they
to report. Yeah.
Yeah. I know when there was the war, like with Afghanistan, right? Like daily, there was just news all the time about the events unfolding there. So, wow, I can't believe that even back then. Also,
I guess it was the early times where the news media was starting to see that more sensationalist news and imageries that are shocking is going to get the attention of the people.
Well, it's happening.
That's what
it's happening today. With the Ukraine. And all of the news, because the United States is providing military support and financial support to the war, every day, there's a big political struggle going on right now about whether we should continue to fund that war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Regarding like the news talking about this war, was there also the mention of American soldiers killing innocent Vietnamese people? Like, is a lot of that true? Or because I've heard some stories here and there where some of them, like during really difficult times were going after innocent people, and that was creating outrage amongst the American public.
I would say yes. In the latter stages of the war, there was some of that. The Lieutenant Kelly situation certainly brought that to a head. I am aware that when we captured enemy soldiers, there was an attempt to get as much intelligence from them as we possibly could, and the manner by which that happened could be very, very brutal. Wasn't supposed to be that way, but it did happen. I was fortunate in that I was in a free fire zone, meaning that I was never near any villages or towns, and anyone that we encountered was the enemy and could be shot. I was only once in a blocking force around a village that was being searched by ARVN soldiers, but that was as close as I ever got to a village or civilian soldiers. But yeah, especially if you had lost, American soldiers got very angry if they had lost men, and everybody was armed. Everybody had a weapon, so it happened. There were occasions when it happened. We did not allow it, but it did happen.
I guess also just, being sleep deprived, just tired and mentally, physically. And also I think there was drug use as well amongst the soldiers to calm down their nerves.
Pot was very, very frequent, especially toward the end of the war. No question about that it was readily available. Again, I was in an area where we would be out in the field for 4 weeks, 5 weeks. The longest I ever was out was 6 weeks, without a change of clothes, I might add. Got pretty ripe.
Wow.
So when we came into a battalion-sized base camp, that's about 600 men, the only contact with friendlies would be a platoon that would be sent out on patrol on a daily basis, usually with a mine sweep, to check that there were no booby traps set out. And they would go down to the watering hole, which allowed men to, take a swim. And the friendlies would come up with cold Cokes. I don't know where they got it off the black market, I guess. And they could buy marijuana. I never allowed it in the field, but it was overlooked within a base camp. And but we couldn't get hard liquor. We couldn't, we just didn't. You only got $50 a month when you were in the field, and it was all what was called script, funny money. It wasn't real American dollars. And they changed it every 4 to 6 weeks. So that was what you bartered with, or played blackjack with. There were some marathon blackjack games that went on. But toward the end of the war, in the latter part of the war, that's when soldiers began to have a much more conservative. They did not wish to be placed in harm's way. They did not want officers to be overly aggressive, because everyone knew that we were at the tail end of this war, and soldiers were being brought home, and those that were still out in the field just did not want to die for a tie, or have their lives unnecessarily risked. So that was true. I was not in Vietnam at that time, but I've done enough research to know that did happen.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's very, very complex, and a lot of factors into this war. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I also want to ask, in today's time, since you've had this experience, would you recommend any young person to join the military today, what you've lived through?
Well, today's military in the United States is an all-volunteer army. And for a young person, with a modest education, it's a wonderful opportunity. It really is a significant opportunity to develop themselves both physically and mentally, to learn a profession, to learn a trade. And after 3 or 4 years to mature, coming out of high school, and then to have this 3 to 4 year experience, often including travel, which very likely they would not have the opportunity to do so. And then the GI Bill would allow them to go to college and complete their education. So there's some really significant benefits that if a bright young fellow or woman wanted to improve themselves and not have the resources to do so, this is a way to do it. So it's not for everybody, but it does offer an avenue and a path for those who may not have other resources that provide for them.
Okay.
Do you have any good memories from your time in the military? I know we're talking a lot about the negatives here, but
Yeah.
how about you tell us a story about something positive that you remember that maybe would incite other people to join the military?
Well, I honestly don't have very many of those. I had a pretty difficult time in the military, and after I came out of Alaska, I was on orders to go to the career course, and I stopped in at Washington, D.C. To the Office of Personnel Operations to find out what was in store for me. And I met with a major who was supposed to be my counselor, and this major was an armor officer. And I thought it was very strange to have an armor officer. That's a person with a tank. Armor means tanks, and counseling an infantry officer. And this armor officer had no battle experience whatsoever. He had never been in combat. And he said to me, "Well, Captain Bartlett, you're in the top 5% of your class. We're sending you to the career course at Fort Benning, Georgia, and then we're going to send you to the Monterey Language Institute, teach you how to speak Vietnamese, and send you back to Vietnam for your second tour as a Vietnamese unit advisor. And if there was one job in Vietnam that was worse than being a platoon leader in combat, it was being a Vietnamese unit advisor." And I said, "Well, that's not really what I had in mind." And I told them what I wanted to do, which was to go to Germany and be a military attaché. And they said, "Well, we can talk about that when you come back from your second tour in Vietnam. And this is what we have you programmed for." And I said, "Well, unprogram me. I don't want to do that. I've got 2 Purple Hearts. I don't need another. And I don't wish to pursue that path." And they said, "Well, this is what we have you programmed for. Take the weekend and think it over." Because and I said, "Well, listen, the career course is voluntary, and I'm going to unvolunteer, and I will resign my commission." I said, "Well, you can't resign your commission because you've been back in the United States and you've accepted orders transferring you to Georgia to go to the career course. So you're obligated for another year. And if you choose not to go to the career course, then we're going to send you back to Vietnam right now.
Wow.
Take the weekend and think it over."
Wow. Okay.
So that's exactly what I said. "Oh, okay." So I took the weekend. I called my father and I just said, "Listen, I am not going to be programmed. This is not right for me." I came back on Monday morning and I met with this same major. And I said, "Okay, you go ahead and reassign me to Vietnam right now, but I want my resignation on file for 365 days from today." And I figured, well, let's see. I've got a month of vacation still coming, so that cuts my tour to 11 months, and then I'll take some R&R, and I could probably get away with about 10 months in Vietnam. And I would be assigned to an American unit, not as a Vietnamese unit advisor. So this major goes and huddles with 2 other majors, and they have a discussion. They come back. The same guy comes back, and he says, "Well, let's not be hasty. Here, the Army has spent all this money to move you and your family from Alaska to Georgia." Well, I realized right then and there he'd never looked at my records because I was a bachelor and everything I owned fit in my car. But for the first time in my life, I kept my mouth shut. And he said, "We'll send you on down to Georgia and they'll find a job for you. You can be an instructor or something. And if you change your mind, we'll reprogram you for the career course." And I said, "Okay." So I went on down to Georgia, and I ended up with the leadership department of the infantry school, which is like the management department of a college. And I had a really wonderful assignment, final assignment within the Army. I was put on a special task force to develop a course of instruction that was implemented Army-wide called Leadership for Professionals. And this was before PowerPoint, before computers. So we did a book of readings and a lesson plan, and we had overhead transparencies. And it was a very profitable assignment because it led me to my civilian career in publishing. But in answer to your question, your original question, I had some funny things that happened to me in Vietnam. Those are some of the stories in my book. But overall, my military experience was on the downside.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing all these stories. I think it's gonna benefit a lot of people, and thank you for being transparent about your views on the war and just like the overlying conflict of back in the day. So, do you have any other questions?
I have one last thing I'd like to contribute. It may not be appropriate for your Canadian audience, but maybe it is. Never can tell. Vietnam veterans are starting to walk in the boots of World War II veterans. There are very few of those left, and Korean veterans. And in the United States, it's very common to recognize these veterans by saying, "Thank you for your service." And there's really nothing wrong with that statement whatsoever. That's a very fine thing to say. But for Vietnam veterans, there's some code words. And you can recognize Vietnam veterans because typically they're wearing baseball caps with their unit insignia on them. They're in their 70s, and it's a proud bunch, tough, proud bunch. But if you say the words "welcome home" to a Vietnam veteran, you will bring lumps to our throat and tears to our eyes. It's a game changer. So whenever you meet, if and when you ever were to meet a Vietnam veteran, try it. Welcome home. Those are the code words that will tell them that you have an appreciation for the war that we fought.
Yeah, so that was actually my last question I was going to ask you about the welcome home.
Sorry.
Well, no, I'm really glad you brought that up because can you explain the difference between saying the welcome home versus thank you for your service? Where do those two words come from, like per se?
They come from the fact that American soldiers coming back from Vietnam were not welcomed home. They were spit upon. They were called baby killers. They were called losers. They lost the war. And there were no parades. There was no acknowledgement of the work that they did. And, they fought valiantly. They fought, they defended the Constitution of the United States. And they have not received the recognition that they richly deserve. And by saying welcome home, as opposed to thank you for your service, it acknowledges something that's very meaningful to us.
Yeah. Well, welcome home, Robin.
Thank you.
Welcome home, yes.
Yeah, we really appreciate you coming on and telling all these incredible stories. Like, I think it must have been hard for you to like keep those, all those memories inside for all those decades. And I hope, you keep, spreading your story now that you're, finally spreading the word. So.
Well, the book is doing very, very well. I'm very pleased with the impact that it's having. I just recently won the 2023 New York City Big Book Award for military nonfiction.
Oh. Great.
And I got a wonderful, wonderful review in the On Point Journal of American Army History. So I'm extremely pleased with the impact that my stories are having, and my website is www.robinbartlettauthor.com, and there's a lot of more rich information there, videos, and I would encourage everyone to spend time taking a look there, reading some of my blogs. I have a wealth of pictures, artwork, and resources.
For sure.
Yeah. I really recommend people to go out and buy your book because, like I said, I'm in the middle of it right now, and it's really amazing.
Yeah.
So good work on that.
We definitely thank you, for sharing your story, and I think a lot more people like you should, share these stories because, the people who watch the news and see a certain perspective that's being fed to them don't always understand the complexities of a thing that we call war. And
yep.
We thank
young
you
people
for,
today have no concept of the Vietnam War, of any war, to be honest with you.
of any war. Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking to you. So
yeah, and hopefully
so we don't become those ignorant young people.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much. I really have enjoyed it. Enjoyed talking to you.
It was great.
Thank you for coming on.